Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. To celebrate my first Booktube anniversary, I decided to put out a call for questions about books or anything else, which I promised to answer this week. I got some wonderful questions here on Booktube and also over on Instagram. There are a lot of questions, and I can get pretty long-winded when I start telling stories, so I'll get started right away. First, some bookish questions. The very first question to come in after I posted the Q&A notice was from Steve Donahue, who asked two. His first question is, what space does Booktube, watching, filming, commenting, and just thinking, take up in your average day? When I first started my channel, I was only following a fairly limited number of booktubers, making short videos, and trying to balance it with a new career opportunity that was complicated, to say the least. The videos were short, but I often had to film a couple of times because of my nervousness. And honestly, I spent quite a bit of time editing my videos since I was trying to correct my constant misspeaks. And I was new to editing. I've gotten more comfortable with both processes, but my videos have also gotten longer. In addition, I follow more people and want to watch all their videos and sometimes comment. I am horribly behind on that part, even though it might be the part about Booktube I like most. There are definitely times when I know I have a choice between reading and watching. And to be honest, reading usually wins. That reading part would happen without Booktube, of course, but it isn't some hobby that can be shoved aside when things get busy here on Booktube. I do feel a bit of self-imposed pressure to get videos up a couple of times a week. Still, I really appreciate that I can take a break from my usual loose pattern here whenever I need. The part that surprises me about this endeavor is how much time I spend thinking about Booktube. Even when I'm talking with my family and friends about books, I'm now trying to imagine what I'm going to say about books here on the channel. And perhaps even more weirdly, possibly intensified because of the isolation the pandemic has brought, I wind up telling stories to my husband and son about you lot, my new friends here on Booktube. I would say y'all instead of you lot, but since I'm responding directly to Steve here, I refrained this one time, given his recent little tirade. More about accents later. Anyway, Booktube has not yet invaded my sleeping hours. William Faulkner and his literary world are populating my nightmares right now, and I'm a little tired of it. Steve's second question, quote, not to be that birthday guest, but in general terms, what are some flaws or problems you might see in Booktube generally? You're pushing the conflict-avoidant booktuber to talk about problems? Of course, the very worst part of Booktube is that you folks make me buy way too many books. But there are other things that sometimes bother me. I've been very lucky not to have any cruel or really weird comments, but I've seen them on other people's channels. And sometimes I see people try to raise controversial questions in their videos without actually seeming to care about the issues at all. They just seem to think it's a way to get viewers. Don't get me wrong, a lot of my favorite booktubers are committed to talking about some controversial questions because they care intensely about these issues, and they also care about having conversations with people who might disagree with them. They know that having these conversations can help both of them think differently or more deeply. But still, there are times when, quote, content creators seem to be constructing a brand more than talking about ideas they care about. Another issue that gives me pause, but which I'm a bit more conflicted about, sometimes I think people in Booktube feel pressured to read books they really don't want to read. Reading outside their comfort zones, as the phrase goes, when it comes to authors' backgrounds, is a really important commitment, and one I respect tremendously. I also think it's important to refrain from judging other people's reading choices as somehow inferior. Don't read classics just because you think it will impress someone else. Don't read Booker Award-winning books if you much prefer mysteries to so-called literary fiction. Similarly, if you love to read classics, do you really need to read outside your comfort zone and force yourself to spend your time on science fiction or westerns when there's such an enormous number of titles within your comfort zone you are still eager to get to? If you think there is a reason to do so, please read broadly. But don't do it because you think Booktube watchers are judging you, even if they are. Next, Gemma from the channel Read a Book Gem asks what my ideal reading space is. And by space here, she means a literal space, not Steve's space-time from the previous question. My favorite place to read has long been reclining on the relatively firm couch in the living room. It's not soft enough to encourage napping, and the light is just terrific during the daytime. The couch faces a large double window at the front of the house, and the afternoon sun just lights up the whole room. I used to read there a lot, back before the pandemic. Now that there are other people in the house during the day, it's not quite as convenient for my reading spot. More frequently now, I read upstairs in my day room, which was my son's bedroom when he was younger. I often prop up pillows on the day bed and sit cross-legged on it sideways, as if it were a chair rather than a bed. Very recently, we brought an old wooden rocking chair up from the basement into the room, and I think it, in conjunction with an old trunk that will turn into my footrest, may become my new favorite reading spot. Gemma continues her question by asking if I like background music or sound, a drink or a snack, etc. I like silence while I read. I can deal with cicadas and the noise from fans during the summer, though. As it's cooled down over the last few days, I'm much more aware of the sounds of other working humans in the house, and to be honest, I find it distracting, even when the doors are closed. So I suspect I will need to find some sort of non-disruptive background music or other noise to help me ignore whatever else is happening. As for snacks, I often try to read when I am eating, but I never eat when I'm trying to read. That is, I'll bring my books to the lunch table, but I don't bring snacks to my library spot. I do often bring a hot cup of tea. But to be honest, after I have ignored the cup over however many pages I've read, I often spot the full cup of tea beside me and drink it cold. Next, Lautrec asks if I remember the first book I read, the first book I absolutely loved, and also the first book that I hated. I love this question. I was a fairly early reader, and I don't know what the first book I read by myself was for sure. I wonder if my mother remembers. If I had to guess, I would say Make Way for Ducklings, a classic picture book by Robert Lawson. I don't remember my parents reading it to me, but I remember reading it aloud to them. And I have such vivid memories of my father reading it to my younger brother. He must have read it a zillion times. What I remember most is my father changing every place name and every personal name to something from our own community. For example, there's a scene when Lawson lists all the ducklings with their rhyming, alphabetically ordered names. Dad would choose one of my brother's young playmates and riff on versions of that child's name instead. Maybe Mark, Nark, Oark, Park, Quark, etc. My brother would completely melt down. No, that's not right! Eventually he got so frustrated he grabbed the book and said, I'll just read it myself. I suspect something similar happened to me. Perhaps I should pass this strategy on to the reading pedagogy people. So, the first book I really loved. Backstory. Every week when my first grade class went into the school library for library day, we could choose a picture book or two from a group of books on a long table, pre-selected for us by the librarian. When I commented that I had already read all the choices that week, the librarian grinned, waved at the back shelves, and told me to pick out anything I wanted. I chose the fattest book I could find, a dark blue cloth-bound biography of Helen Keller. The book completely sucked me in, starting a long history of both loving nonfiction as well as reading books which challenged me. I checked that volume out from the library again and again. The first real novel I fell in love with was Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. From the time I was in third grade until I graduated from high school, I think I must have read Little Women every winter as I watched the people around me celebrating Christmas right along as the March family did in the book. When I was very young, I saw parts of me in all four of the sisters. In those early years, I was especially drawn to the first part of the novel, full of stories of the girls when they were young. When I read the novel recently, well, later in my life, it was maybe 25 years ago now, I was surprised how much I was drawn instead to the second part of the novel, dealing with the sisters' complex lives as the young women matured. I still read the book regularly. The first book I ever really hated, I think, was not until the end of high school. I know I've told the story before here on this channel, but I'll try to tell it again here. I was 17 years old, and it was the night before a big college scholarship interview. I was nervous. My mother's collection of classic novels lived on the top shelves of the built-in bookcases along one wall of my childhood bedroom. And as I got older and taller, I used to pull various volumes down whenever I needed something to read. That night I thought a slim book would be perfect to keep me calm and distracted. I pulled down Edith Wharton's Ethan Frome, an old Norton Critical edition as I remember it. I started reading and absolutely hated it. Hated the characters and their closed-off, weak meanness to each other. Well, the next day I sat in the scholarship interview with 5 or 6 interviewers asking me all sorts of questions. One of the first, "What's the best book you've read recently?" And I immediately launched into a rant about how I had just read the worst book I'd ever read the night before and why I hated it. When I finished, I felt like an idiot and stumbled around trying to emerge from the world of the book I had just spent 20 minutes reliving and shift to some book I loved. Why didn't I just talk about Jane Eyre or Pride and Prejudice or maybe Antigone? Of course, now I realize that a rant about how much I hated a particular classic book and why actually showed that I was in fact a fairly serious reader, at least as much as saying I loved a book. I got the scholarship. Still, my hatred of Ethan Frome was so visceral that it took me almost 3 decades to read any other Edith Wharton books. Now I absolutely love The House of Mirth, especially An Age of Innocence, and Custom of the Country, but I still haven't tried Ethan Frome again. I just can't bring myself to do it when there are so many amazing books still to be read surrounding it on my shelves. Next question. Claudia at Spencer's Library asks how Booktube has changed my reading behavior. One way it hasn't changed my reading is that I have always been a theme reader. I'm quite likely to spend weeks in a row reading works by and about Jane Austen, or Faulkner, or Shakespeare, or Victorian novels, or whatever. What is new is that I now plan to do it not by lark, but by plan, and I do it to a calendar, 1 month at a time. I think that is probably the biggest change. Perhaps if I get a little bit more formal about Booktube, I might feel some pressure to read more books, or to read more current books, or more fiction than I'm reading now, a change that's happened this year because of the pandemic and not because of Booktube. Oh, one thing that has changed is that I listen a bit more to audiobooks than I did before. They still are a very small part of my life, but y'all have helped me find a few ways that work better for me than I had figured out before. Listening to novels I had read before, listening to nonfiction, for example. Claudia's second question is, what surprised you about being on Booktube? 2 things. First, people complimenting me about seeming to be comfortable in front of a camera. I promise you that is all an illusion. But what a wonderful compliment. And the other surprise is how quickly I made friends with people who live in very different places and time zones, etc. Roz, at Scallywdaddling About the Books, said somewhere that her spouse teases her about calling her associates here on Booktube her friends. But I totally agree with her. The friendships here seem awfully real, and I feel like a lot of you understand parts of me that not all my in real life friends really get. And having all these new friends live all around the globe instead of just down the street is amazing. Yes, there are limits. All of the people I follow are able to speak English comfortably enough that they've chosen to post at least some of their videos in English. But I think I have an insight into and a connection with the broad bookish world, and perhaps the world in general, that I would never have been able to get in any other way. Pop the Bubble Chart Leaks asks, do you take random history questions? I'd like to hear your wisdom. I know an astonishingly limited amount of history, given that I have a PhD in history and have written a couple of academic books. You are welcome to ask me any random history questions you like. If I know the answer, or have an easy way of getting a more sophisticated answer to a specific question than you might have just by going through Google, I'll be happy to tell you whatever I think. No promises that it will be wise, and if I don't have any idea, except what one could look up on the basic outline sources like Wikipedia, I'll defer rather than answer, but please feel free to ask. Selma asks if I have ever written a work of fiction, and if not, if I've considered it. I think I wrote a short story back in middle school, but I really have not written any fiction since then. In college, I took a few poetry writing classes, one of which I'll mention later, I think. But at some point, I realized that I was a far better editor than I was a poet. I really fell in love with writing long-form analytical nonfiction when I was writing my senior thesis as a college history major. I then went to grad school, wrote a PhD dissertation, and turned it into a book, and then wrote another academic history book. Since then, I have considered writing a couple of different, less academic nonfiction books, outlining them and sketching out a few chapters. The first was about my lack of religious faith, a subject I'll discuss later in response to several questions, but I could not come up with a way to finish the book, and I felt less than confident about telling stories my family might not want told publicly right now. For years, my notes for that book have been in a file folder, and I suppose I might go back to it. The other nonfiction book I have in mind is mostly just an idea at this point, something I hope a friend of mine and I will work on together at some point soon. Fiction, on the other hand, seems incredibly intimidating. I can't quite imagine coming up with a topic and plot completely out of whole cloth. But here is one idea, one I will not be using myself, so feel free to take it if you find it useful. A young man is sent home from college because of the quarantine to live at home in a 3-generation family. He had spent the last few years studying the Transcendentalist in college, especially Thoreau. While he's home with no summer job opportunities and a really uncertain path to a future academic career, he and his retired grandfather decide to build a tiny house together out in the woods near their house. Over time, he becomes more self-reliant, while at the same time building a deeper relationship with his grandfather. I think the author of this novel would have to know something about carpentry, which I do not, but I think it might make a great pandemic novel. Actually, maybe because I'm a nonfiction writer at heart, I think this plot might make an even better memoir, if I could find the right people to live it and then write about it. Selma's next questions are about books I found to be life-changing, which are perhaps less well-known or that I'd like to see more people read. And a related prompt, do I have particular authors on my shelves who feel like soulmates? Sometimes I think a lot of my personality is mirrored by Jane Eyre and Antigone, the plain and quiet but still internally fierce characters who insist on their own ways, on doing what they think is right. At first, did these characters feel like soulmates because I recognized them when I read the books? Or did these characters shape who I became? I'm not sure. As for authors who feel like soulmates, there are moments when I think George Eliot might be, although I still have an enormous amount of her writing left to read. There's definitely a streak of Eudora Welty in me, but she was a bit more extroverted, I think. When I read Alice Walker's early essays, but not necessarily her fiction, I think I'm often recognizing a twin sister there too. As for books that were life-changing, I think David Alpert's And the Skylark Sings With Me might have been most literally life-changing. He was the father of daughters who seemed like they were not unlike my son, and he raised them with deep respect and provided an education for them that pulled in a community he didn't always know even existed until his children began to express their own interests. The book transformed how I thought about children and about my own child as a student, but also as a person. It obviously is not the right book for everyone, but I found it to be quite inspiring. Selma's last question is, what is your favorite thing about being on Booktube so far? I've already suggested some answers, and I might suggest some more, but for here, I'll say that I really love taking the time to work through what I've read, enough to talk about it here on the channel. Knowing that I'll likely talk about a lot of books I read over the week or month makes me think about how they work as individual books and how they might compare to each other, and sometimes how they're connected to what other people are talking about on their channels. I know that making reviews for Goodreads or for a professional site would have a bit of the same power, but Booktube feels like a more personal and social and more integrated spot for it. That's just one favorite part, but it's definitely cool. The next comment. Peter Gardner says he remembers me talking about the works of Alfie Kohn and asks me to talk about one thing from his books that I found particularly helpful when I was parenting. Actually, I first ran across his work, maybe on a table at Borders back in the day, long before I was a parent. I picked up his book, Punished by Rewards, because it was vaguely connected to issues of tying college teacher pay to so-called performance. That is, in the case of my university, how students or others evaluated their professors. I was very unsure about the wisdom of that model, an issue I won't go into now, but which Alfie Kohn was also questioning, albeit in a different context. He seemed to agree with me that people do their best work when they're doing that work because they think it's important and because they love being involved with that work, not because they're paid for specific outcomes. If you get rewards for doing good work, it emphasizes the importance of earning rewards rather than the importance of doing good work. When it comes to parenting, the part of Alfie Kohn that I saw as a soulmate, as Selma asked, was his emphasis on unconditional love. Too many children grow up thinking their parents value them more or even love them more when they win awards or do something really well. I was lucky to grow up with parents who made it very clear that they loved me just as much whether I was good at something or not. They made me feel like it was safe to try new things. They never acted like they would be tremendously proud of me if I was great at whatever thing I tried to do. Instead, they showed their pride in me because I tried new things. I think Alfie Kohn really helped me understand what they were doing when I was young, and his book helped me figure out how to enact it when I parented my own child. Right about the time my spouse and I were reading Alfie Kohn, we started using a phrase we still say very frequently, to each other even, sometimes as encouragement and sometimes as a direct compliment. The more you practice, the better you get. I don't think the line is from Kohn himself, but it definitely fits with his philosophy. It's a statement emphasizing that commitment and work are things we value more than natural talent. That actually might be one of the less important parts of Kohn's argument, but it was one of the easiest to start putting into practice. Okay, next question. Ed at Gagging for Lit asks if there's a book I admired on a technical level but actually disliked as a reading experience, or which wasn't for me? This is a really fascinating question, and one that's left me a bit flummoxed. I think I'm going to choose the work of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Interestingly, Matthew at Mayberry Books, whose question's coming up later in this Q&A, just talked about Fitzgerald in a way that makes me want to try his work again. I find his prose absolutely beautiful, and I respect his pacing and his use of symbolism and everything else enormously. But I find him awfully misogynistic and awfully entitled, too. If you're a Fitzgerald lover, I would love for you to give me a good argument in the comments to help encourage me to read him again. It's been a really long time, and I've matured a bit as a reader. Well, this video was long enough for today. I'll be back very soon with part 2 of this question and answer session, probably on Wednesday, since I have something else planned for tomorrow. I hope you'll join me then, here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.